The whistle of the eastbound train pierced the Montana dawn like a sharp knife, cutting through the silence with its lonely cry. Elizabeth Foster pressed her forehead against the cool window glass, watching the endless golden fields roll past. Beneath a sky so vast it seemed to swallow the horizon whole. Beside her, 7-year-old Emma slept with her head on Elizabeth's lap, while 4-year-old Thomas was curled against her side, his small hand clutching his sister's sleeve even in sleep. The children had finally succumbed to exhaustion after days of travel, their faces peaceful in a way Elizabeth hadn't seen since before their father's passing. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 5 days they had been traveling from Chicago. 5 days of soot and uncertainty, of carefully rationed meals and restless nights in cramped seats. 5 days since Elizabeth had sold every possession of value she owned to purchase their tickets west, betting everything on a correspondence that had given her hope during the darkest months of her life. The conductor's voice boomed through the car. Pine Valley Station, next stop, Pine Valley, Montana. Elizabeth's stomach tightened with a mixture of anticipation and dread. After 8 months of letters, after careful planning and desperate hope, she was about to meet the man who had promised her a new beginning. James Sullivan, established cattle rancher, respected member of his community, seeking a proper wife to share his prosperous life in the Montana Territory. She had been honest about being widowed. She had mentioned that her late husband had left her in difficult circumstances. What she had not explicitly stated was that her difficult circumstances included 2 bright, energetic children who needed a father figure as much as she needed a husband. The omission had been calculated, born of desperation rather than deception. After responding to dozens of advertisements from men seeking wives, Elizabeth had learned that mentioning children resulted in immediate silence, no matter how she phrased it, how she emphasized their good behavior and quick minds. Potential suitors disappeared the moment they learned she came with a family package. So she had crafted her letters to James Sullivan carefully, honestly describing herself as a 28-year-old widow with household skills, education, and a desire to build a respectable life in the growing frontier. She had shared details about her late husband's work as a bookkeeper, her own experience managing their household finances, and her dreams of contributing to a thriving ranch community. Every word had been true, just incomplete. Now as the train began its approach to Pine Valley Station, Elizabeth's carefully constructed hope felt as fragile as thin ice on a spring pond. What if James Sullivan proved to be another William Porter, more concerned with appearances than substance? What if he took one look at Emma and Thomas and decided their arrangement was null and void? "Mama?" Emma stirred awake, blinking up at her with eyes the same shade of hazel as her father's had been. "Are we there? Is this where we're going to live?" Elizabeth smoothed her daughter's unruly auburn hair, straightening her small jacket and checking that the ribbon holding her precious doll was secure. "Yes, sweetheart. This is Pine Valley. Remember what we talked about?" Emma nodded solemnly, suddenly wide awake and alert. "Be polite and helpful. Don't interrupt grown-up conversations. Say sir and ma'am." She paused, worrying her lower lip between her teeth. "But Mama, what if he doesn't like us?" The question pierced Elizabeth's heart. Emma had endured too much uncertainty for a child her age, too many changes and disappointments. When pneumonia had taken her father 18 months ago, leaving them with debts that consumed everything they owned, Emma had adapted with a resilience that both amazed and worried her mother. She had become a second mother to Thomas, helping care for him when Elizabeth took in sewing to make ends meet. "Any man would be lucky to have you as children," she told them firmly, gently waking Thomas as she spoke. "You're kind, smart, and brave. Those are the qualities that matter." Through the window, Pine Valley emerged from the landscape like a promise half kept. It was larger than she had expected, with a proper main street lined with substantial wooden buildings, church, spires reaching toward the cloudless sky, and the bustle of commerce that spoke of prosperity. Beyond the town, rolling hills stretched to the horizon, dotted with pine trees and crossed by silver ribbons of creek beds. The train shuddered to a halt with a great hiss of steam. Elizabeth gathered their single traveling bag, checked that. The children were presentable, and led them toward the door. Her legs felt unsteady as they stepped onto the wooden platform. Whether from 5 days of travel or from nerves, she couldn't say. The October air was crisp and clean, carrying scents of pine and dried grass that were nothing like the heavy industrial smell of Chicago. Around them, other passengers hurried about their business, greeting family members, directing porters with luggage, calling out to friends. Elizabeth stood still for a moment, scanning the faces for one that might belong to James Sullivan. She spotted him immediately, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a clean white shirt beneath a brown leather vest. He stood near the station house with the confident posture of a man accustomed to being noticed. His dark hair was neatly combed, his boots polished, his whole appearance speaking of success and respectability. When their eyes met across the platform, he smiled and began walking toward them. Elizabeth's heart sank as she watched his expression change. The welcoming smile faltered as his gaze moved from her face to Emma and Thomas standing quietly at her sides. She saw the exact moment when understanding dawned, when he realized that his mail-order bride came with complications he hadn't bargained for. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Miss Foster? His voice was carefully controlled, but she caught the note of confusion beneath the politeness. Mrs. Foster, she corrected gently, extending her hand. It's a pleasure to finally meet you, Mr. Sullivan. Thank you for the travel arrangements. He shook her hand briefly, his attention already returning to the children. And these are my children. Elizabeth placed a protective hand on each child's shoulder. Emma and Thomas. Emma is 7, and Thomas just turned 4 last month. Children, this is Mr. Sullivan. Emma executed a perfect curtsy, just as Elizabeth had taught her. Pleased to meet you, sir. Thank you for letting us come to Montana. Thomas, following his sister's lead, attempted a small bow. Hello, Mr. Sullivan, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The courtesy seemed to catch James off guard. He studied the children for a long moment, taking in their neat appearance, their respectful demeanor, the way they stood close to their mother without hiding behind her skirts. You didn't mention children in your letters, James said finally, his voice neutral but his meaning clear. Elizabeth lifted her chin, refusing to show the panic clawing at her chest. I mentioned that I was widowed under difficult circumstances. Emma and Thomas are my children. They're well-behaved, intelligent, and quite helpful around a household. I'm sure they are, James's tone suggested otherwise. But Mrs. Foster, I was expecting to marry a woman, not suddenly acquire a ready-made family. They're just children, Elizabeth said, fighting to keep her voice steady. They won't be any trouble. They can help with chores, and that's not the point. James glanced around the platform, clearly aware of the curious stares their conversation was attracting. I have a position in this community to consider. I can't suddenly appear with a wife and 2 children without proper explanations. Thomas tugged at Elizabeth's skirt. Mama, does he not want us? The innocent question, delivered in a whisper that nevertheless carried in the crisp air, seemed to strike James like a physical blow. Several nearby passengers had stopped their own activities to watch the drama unfolding, and Elizabeth saw disapproval on more than one face. Disapproval directed not at her, but at the man rejecting children. Mr. Sullivan, Elizabeth said quietly, perhaps we could discuss this somewhere more private. He shook his head, his jaw set in stubborn lines. There's nothing to discuss, Mrs. Foster. I paid for your train ticket, but the debt is now settled. I cannot proceed with an arrangement that was made under false pretenses. False pretenses? Anger flared in Elizabeth's chest, hot and protective. I never lied to you. I told you I was a widow seeking a new start. That's exactly what I am. You omitted crucial information. James settled his hat more firmly on his head, the gesture indicating finality. The afternoon stage to Helena leaves at 3 o'clock. I suggest you make arrangements to return to Chicago. With what money? Elizabeth wanted to scream. She had spent every cent she possessed on their journey to Montana, believing in good faith that James Sullivan was an honorable man who would keep his word. Instead, she found herself stranded in a strange town with 2 confused children and less than $8 to her name. Mr. Sullivan, she tried once more. Surely we can. But he was already walking away, his back rigid with disapproval, leaving Elizabeth and her children standing alone on the platform with their single bag and shattered hopes. Mama? Emma's voice was small and uncertain. Why doesn't he want us? Did I do something wrong? Elizabeth knelt beside her children, gathering them into her arms, breathing in the familiar scent of their hair to steady herself. Around them, the platform was emptying as passengers departed with their families, leaving her feeling more isolated than she had ever felt in her life. You did nothing wrong, she whispered fiercely. Nothing at all. Sometimes grown-ups make decisions that don't make sense, but that doesn't mean you're not wonderful exactly as you are. She stood, taking each child by the hand firmly in hers. They might be stranded, they might be nearly penniless, but she would not let despair take hold. She had survived worse: her husband's death, the loss of their home, the months of poverty, and uncertainty that had driven her to seek a mail-order marriage in the first place. She would find a way forward, with or without James Sullivan's help. Come on, she told the children, shouldering their bag with determination. Let's find somewhere to get our bearings and figure out what to do next. The town of Pine Valley stretched before them, unknown and challenging, but Elizabeth Foster had not traveled 1,000 miles to give up at the first setback. Somewhere in this frontier community, there had to be opportunity for a woman willing to work hard and 2 bright children eager to learn. As they walked toward the main street, Elizabeth caught sight of a weathered man in work clothes loading supplies into a wagon. He had noticed their exchange with James Sullivan, she realized, and his expression held something that looked remarkably like sympathy. Perhaps not everyone in Pine Valley would judge them as harshly as James Sullivan had. Perhaps there were still people in this world who understood that family came in many forms, and that love was not diminished by circumstances beyond one's control. Elizabeth held her children's hands tighter and walked toward their uncertain future with her head held high, ready to face whatever came next. The Pine Valley Hotel stood at the corner of Main and Church Streets, a 2-story building with weathered green paint and a hand-carved sign that had seen better days. Elizabeth hesitated at the entrance, Emma and Thomas's small hands warm in hers, calculating and recalculating the coins in her purse. $8, $12. Even if the proprietor charged the most modest rate possible, they could afford perhaps 2 nights, maybe 3 if she could negotiate a reduced price for helping with laundry or kitchen work. The lobby smelled of pine soap and tobacco smoke, with worn but clean furniture arranged around a pot-bellied stove. Behind the registration desk sat a woman perhaps 15 years older than Elizabeth, her gray-streaked hair pulled back in a practical bun, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of the new arrival's appearance. Mrs. Miller, Elizabeth approached the desk with what she hoped was confident composure. I wonder if you might have a room available for myself and my children. The woman's gaze moved pointedly to their single worn traveling bag, then to Emma and Thomas, who were examining a display of local wildlife specimens with the intense curiosity of childhood. You'd be the one James Sullivan was expecting on today's train. It wasn't a question. Word traveled fast in a town the size of Pine Valley, and their very public rejection at the train station had clearly already made the rounds. Elizabeth felt heat rise in her cheeks but kept her voice level. "I am Elizabeth Foster, yes. And these are my children, Emma and Thomas." Mrs. Miller's expression revealed nothing of her thoughts. "Rooms are $1.50 a night. Meals extra if you want them sent up. Payment in advance. $1.50. Elizabeth's heart sank, but she maintained her composure. "That seems quite reasonable. We'll take the room for 3 nights to start." As she counted out the precious coins, Mrs. Miller continued her assessment. "Sullivan mentioned he was expecting a widow woman. Didn't say nothing about no children." "He didn't ask," Elizabeth replied simply, refusing to be drawn into gossip. "Man's got a right to know what he's getting into," Mrs. Miller observed, making no effort to lower her voice. "Running a ranch ain't no place for a woman who can't be honest about her circumstances." The criticism stung, particularly because Elizabeth had wrestled with the ethics of her omission throughout the journey from Chicago. But desperation had driven her to calculated silence, and she would not apologize for protecting her children's interests. "A man also has a right to honor his word once given," she replied quietly, accepting the heavy brass key Mrs. Miller offered. The room was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single window overlooking the bustling Main Street. Emma and Thomas immediately went to the window, pressing their noses against the glass to watch the activity below. "Look, Mama, there's a real blacksmith shop and a man with a horse that's bigger than our whole apartment back home," Thomas exclaimed, his earlier distress temporarily forgotten in the excitement of new discoveries. Elizabeth set their bag on the bed and joined them at the window. Pine Valley was indeed a thriving community, with obvious signs of prosperity and growth. Wagons loaded with goods moved steadily along the main thoroughfare. Women in clean dresses emerged from well-stocked shops, and men in business attire conducted transactions on the wooden sidewalks. This was exactly the sort of place where an industrious woman might build a new life, if she could find a way to establish herself. "Are we going to stay here, Mama?" Emma asked, her voice holding the careful neutrality she had developed during the uncertain months following her father's death. "For a few days while I figure out our next steps," Elizabeth answered honestly. She had learned that Emma handled uncertainty better when she understood as much of the truth as her young mind could process. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Elizabeth opened it to find a woman, perhaps a few years older than herself, dressed in a practical blue dress with an apron that spoke of recent kitchen work. Her blonde hair was neatly braided and pinned, and her face held the kind of genuine warmth that couldn't be feigned. "Mrs. Foster, I'm Rebecca Thompson. I run the bakery down the street." She glanced past Elizabeth to where the children were still absorbed in their window observations. "I heard about what happened at the station. Thought you might appreciate some fresh bread and perhaps some information about our town." The unexpected kindness nearly undid Elizabeth's carefully maintained composure. "That's very generous of you, Mrs. Thompson. Please come in." Rebecca entered, carrying a cloth-wrapped loaf that filled the small room with the heavenly scent of freshly baked bread. She studied Elizabeth with intelligent blue eyes that missed nothing. "Call me Rebecca. And don't mind Mrs. Miller's commentary. She means no real harm, but she's never had to make the kinds of choices desperate circumstances require." Rebecca's accent carried traces of her Eastern upbringing, softening her words with cultured cadences. "I came to Pine Valley 3 years ago with nothing but my recipes and the clothes on my back, fleeing a father who thought my future should be decided by the highest bidder among his business associates." Elizabeth's eyes widened at the frank admission. "I'm sorry. That must have been terrifying." "It was. But I discovered that sometimes running toward uncertainty is braver than staying with known misery." Rebecca glanced at Emma and Thomas, who had turned from the window at the mention of bread. "And I learned that this town, for all its capacity for gossip, is generally fair to those willing to work hard and contribute to the community. Thomas approached shyly, drawn by the wonderful smell emanating from Rebecca's bundle. "That smells like the bread Mama used to make when Papa was alive." Rebecca smiled, unwrapping the loaf to reveal a perfectly golden crust. "Would you like to try a piece? I added a touch of honey to the dough this morning." As the children savored their bread with the enthusiasm of youngsters who had subsisted on train food for 5 days, Rebecca turned her attention back to Elizabeth. "I don't suppose you have any particular skills or experience that might translate to employment here in Pine Valley?" Elizabeth straightened, recognizing an opportunity when it presented itself. "I managed our household finances when my husband was alive. I'm an accomplished seamstress. I took in sewing after he passed to support us. I'm also experienced with cooking, baking, and all aspects of running an efficient home." Impressive credentials. Rebecca's eyes had sharpened with interest. As it happens, several businesses in town have been struggling to find reliable help. The growth Pine Valley has experienced has outpaced the available workforce, particularly for positions requiring literacy and attention to detail. Hope flickered in Elizabeth's chest, the first genuine optimism she had felt since stepping off the train. "Do you think there might be opportunities for someone in my situation?" "I think there might indeed." Rebecca lowered her voice slightly, though Emma and Thomas were far too absorbed in their bread to pay attention to adult conversation. "James Sullivan's rejection of you this morning has already stirred considerable discussion. Not all of it is unfavorable to your cause." Elizabeth raised an eyebrow. "Oh? James Sullivan is, well, let's say he's a man concerned with appearances and social standing. Some folks admire that quality. Others find it lacking in Christian charity." Rebecca paused meaningfully. "Particularly when it involves rejecting children who have done nothing wrong." Before Elizabeth could respond, another knock came at the door. This time Mrs. Miller's voice called through the wood. "Mrs. Foster, you've got a visitor downstairs. Says he's got business to discuss." Elizabeth's pulse quickened. Perhaps James Sullivan had reconsidered, realized the harshness of his decision. She smoothed her traveling dress and checked that the children's faces were clean of breadcrumbs. "I'll come down with you," Rebecca offered. "If it's Sullivan, you might benefit from having a witness to whatever he has to say." The man waiting in the hotel lobby was not James Sullivan. Instead, a thin gentleman in expensive suit stood, examining the wildlife display with the air of someone accustomed to being kept waiting. He turned as Elizabeth descended the stairs, his pale eyes assessing her with clinical detachment. "Mrs. Foster? I am Harold Bennett, attorney at law." He produced a calling card from his vest pocket. "I represent the interests of several prominent citizens of Pine Valley, including Mr. James Sullivan." Elizabeth's heart sank. Whatever this was, it would not be good news. "Mr. Bennett, how may I help you?" "Mr. Sullivan has expressed concern about your situation here in Pine Valley. As a respected member of our community, he feels a certain responsibility to ensure that appropriate arrangements are made for your departure." The carefully neutral language didn't disguise the message. James Sullivan wanted her gone, and he was prepared to use legal pressure to achieve that goal. "I'm not aware of any law preventing a widow and her children from seeking employment in Montana," Elizabeth replied carefully. Bennett's smile was thin and cold. "Of course not. However, there are vagrancy laws and regulations concerning the welfare of children. A woman without means of support traveling with minor children might find herself subject to uncomfortable scrutiny from local authorities." The threat was delicately veiled but unmistakable. Comply or face the possibility of having Emma and Thomas taken from her on grounds of inadequate provision. Rebecca stepped forward, her voice carrying the authority of an established business owner. "Mr. Bennett, I believe you may be misinformed about Mrs. Foster's circumstances. She is not without means of support." In fact, I am considering offering her employment at my bakery." It was a lie, or at least a significant exaggeration of their brief conversation upstairs, but Elizabeth felt a rush of gratitude for the unexpected support. Bennett's eyes narrowed. "Mrs. Thompson, I would caution you against making hasty decisions regarding employees. The character and background of those we associate with in business reflects upon our own reputations. My reputation was built by my own actions, not by cowering before bullies," Rebecca replied evenly. "Good day, Mr. Bennett." The attorney's jaw tightened at the dismissal, but he was too much of a professional to allow his anger to show openly. Instead, he turned back to Elizabeth. "Mrs. Foster, I trust you will give serious consideration to the wisdom of seeking opportunities elsewhere. Pine Valley is a close-knit community that values stability and traditional arrangements." After he departed, Elizabeth sank into one of the lobby chairs, her legs suddenly weak. The full weight of her situation was becoming clear. She wasn't just facing economic hardship. She was confronting active hostility from someone with enough influence to make her life genuinely difficult. "Don't let him frighten you," Rebecca said firmly, taking the chair beside her. "Bennett represents money and privilege, but he doesn't represent the entire town. There are plenty of people here who believe in judging others by their actions rather than their circumstances." "But are there enough?" Elizabeth asked quietly. "And do they have enough influence to counter a man like James Sullivan?" Rebecca was quiet for a moment, clearly considering the complexities of small-town politics and social dynamics. "That remains to be seen, but I meant what I said about employment. I do need help at the bakery, and your qualifications suggest you could handle far more than I initially imagined." Elizabeth looked up sharply. "You're serious?" "Entirely. The work is demanding, the hours are long, and the pay won't make you wealthy. But it's honest employment, and it would give you a foundation to build upon." For the first time since stepping off the train, Elizabeth felt tears threaten, not tears of despair, but of relief so profound it threatened to overwhelm her. She'd been prepared for rejection, had steeled herself for hardship, but she had not dared hope for genuine kindness from a stranger. "I don't know how to thank you," she managed. "Thank me by proving that my faith in you is well placed," Rebecca replied practically, "and by not letting the James Sullivans of the world convince you that you're worth less than you are." "Mama?" Emma appeared at the bottom of the stairs, having apparently grown tired of waiting upstairs. "Is everything all right?" Elizabeth opened her arms, and Emma came to her without hesitation, settling onto her lap with the easy trust that made her more determined than ever to create a stable life for her children. "Everything is going to be fine, sweetheart," she told her daughter, and for the first time since leaving Chicago, she actually believed it might be true. "We're going to stay in Pine Valley for a while, and I'm going to work for Mrs. Thompson at her bakery." Emma's face lit up. "The lady with the good bread? Can Thomas and I help sometimes too?" Rebecca laughed, a sound full of genuine warmth. "I think we can find some appropriate tasks for helpful young people. Do you know anything about decorating cookies?" As Emma launched into an enthusiastic description of helping her mother with holiday baking back in Chicago, Elizabeth felt something settle in her chest. It wasn't quite peace. There were still too many uncertainties for that, but it was hope, solid and real. James Sullivan had rejected them. Harold Bennett had threatened them. And Mrs. Miller clearly disapproved of their very existence. But Rebecca Thompson had offered them a chance, and sometimes a chance was all that stood between despair and possibility. Elizabeth held her daughter close and began to plan their next steps, no longer as refugees fleeing rejection, but as people with purpose and the promise of honest work. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but it would also bring new opportunities. And if James Sullivan thought he could drive them from Pine Valley through intimidation and social pressure, he was about to discover that Elizabeth Foster had not traveled 1,000 miles to surrender at the first sign of opposition. Dawn came early to Pine Valley, and with it, the sounds of a community stirring to life. Elizabeth had slept poorly in the unfamiliar hotel bed, her mind churning with plans and possibilities, but she rose with determination. Today would mark the beginning of her new life, whatever form it might take. Rebecca Thompson's bakery occupied a corner building on Main Street, its windows already glowing with warm lamplight as Elizabeth approached with Emma and Thomas in tow. The painted sign above the door read Thompson's Bakery in cheerful red letters, and the sweet aroma of baking bread drifted through the cool morning air. "Good morning," Rebecca called softly as she unlocked the front door to let them in. "I hope you all slept well despite yesterday's excitement." "Well enough," Elizabeth replied, though the shadows under her eyes told a different story. She helped the children remove their coats, marveling at how quickly they had adapted to yet another change in circumstances. Emma and Thomas had been raised to face challenges with resilience, but sometimes Elizabeth worried about the toll such constant adjustment took on their young spirits. The interior of the bakery was larger than it appeared from outside, with glass display cases along one wall, small tables arranged for customers who wished to sit and enjoy their purchases, and a work area visible through an archway that led to the kitchen proper. Everything was scrupulously clean and efficiently organized, speaking to Rebecca's competence and attention to detail. "Emma, Thomas, would you like to see where we make the magic happen?" Rebecca asked, gesturing toward the kitchen. The children's eyes widened as they entered the work area. Two massive ovens dominated one wall, their cast iron doors decorated with intricate scrollwork. Long wooden tables provided workspace for kneading and shaping, while shelves lined with mixing bowls, measuring cups, and specialized tools created an atmosphere of purposeful industry. "It's like a castle kitchen." Thomas breathed, clearly enchanted. Rebecca laughed. "I suppose it is, in a way. Would you like to help me start the day's bread while your mother and I discuss business?" As the children were introduced to the mysteries of measuring flour and testing yeast, Rebecca walked Elizabeth through the practical aspects of employment at Thompson's Bakery. "I open at 5 each morning to begin the day's baking," she explained. "Most of our bread sales happen between 7 and 9, when people stop by before work or send their children for family purchases. The afternoon brings cake orders, special requests, and preparation for the next day." Elizabeth watched Rebecca's capable hands demonstrate proper kneading technique, while mentally calculating the logistics of her new routine. "What about Emma and Thomas? I can't leave them alone at the hotel, and I don't want them to be a disruption to your business." "Actually, I've been thinking about that." Rebecca glanced at the children, who were concentrating fiercely on following her instructions for shaping dough. "I could use someone to help with deliveries to the restaurant and hotel. Nothing too heavy, just bread and pastries. Emma seems responsible enough, and Thomas could accompany her until he gets a bit older." Emma looked up hopefully. "I could do that. I'm very good at remembering directions, and I'm careful with breakable things." "It wouldn't interfere with their education," Elizabeth said quickly. "I've been teaching them reading and arithmetic myself, and I intend to continue." "Of course. In fact, running deliveries might help them learn the town and meet other children their age." Rebecca covered the shaped loaves with clean cloth. "These need to rise for an hour before baking. Perfect time for us to visit Mrs. Jenkins about more permanent housing arrangements." They left the children safely occupied with arranging kindling for the ovens under the supervision of Michael, Rebecca's assistant baker, a cheerful young man who had apprenticed with a master baker in Boston before moving west for his health. Elizabeth was grateful for Rebecca's company as they walked toward the residential section of Pine Valley, where neat houses with well-tended gardens spoke of middle-class prosperity. Mrs. Jenkins's boarding house stood on a tree-lined street 3 blocks from the bakery, a substantial 2-story structure with a welcoming front porch and curtains in every window. The proprietor herself answered their knock, a woman in her 60s with silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. "Rebecca, dear, what brings you so early?" Mrs. Jenkins's gaze moved curiously to Elizabeth. "And who might this be?" "Olivia Jenkins. I'd like you to meet Elizabeth Foster. She's going to be working with me at the bakery, and I was hoping you might have suitable accommodations for her and her 2 young children." Mrs. Jenkins studied Elizabeth with the shrewd assessment of someone accustomed to evaluating potential. "Tenants. I heard about the situation at the train station yesterday. Unfortunate business, that." Elizabeth braced herself for another lecture about honesty and propriety, but Mrs. Jenkins's expression held sympathy rather than judgment. "James Sullivan's loss is our community's gain, I suspect," the older woman continued. "I have a nice room on the 2nd floor that would suit a mother and children perfectly. Meals included, laundry facilities available, and a small sitting area where the children could do their studies." The terms were more than reasonable, and Elizabeth felt another piece of her new life falling into place. As they walked back toward the bakery, Rebecca shared more about the community dynamics that would shape Elizabeth's experience in Pine Valley. "Olivia Jenkins is one of the most respected women in town," she explained. "Her approval carries significant weight with the other business owners and families. If she's willing to house you, others will be more inclined to give you a fair chance." They paused outside the general store, where several women had gathered for morning shopping. Elizabeth recognized the type immediately, the wives of prosperous men, the arbiters of social acceptability, the ones who could make or break a newcomer's reputation with a few well-placed words. "That's Mrs. Victoria Hamilton," Rebecca murmured, indicating a well-dressed woman with elaborately styled hair. "Her husband owns the largest ranch in the county after Sullivan's spread. She's particular about social standings." As if sensing their scrutiny, Mrs. Hamilton looked in their direction. Her gaze lingered on Elizabeth with unmistakable curiosity before she turned back to her companions, their heads immediately bending together in animated conversation. "I suspect I'll be the topic of discussion for some time," Elizabeth observed. "Riley, undoubtedly, but don't let that concern you. Victoria Hamilton's opinions carry weight, but they're not the final word on anything." Rebecca's expression grew thoughtful. "Besides, I have a feeling she might surprise you. She's more interested in competence than conformity, despite appearances." They were interrupted by the approach of a tall man leading a horse down the main street. He moved with the easy stride of someone comfortable in his own skin, his clothes practical rather than fashionable, his weathered face suggesting years spent outdoors. When he noticed Rebecca, he changed direction to approach them. "Morning, Rebecca. How's business?" "Thriving, thanks to people like you who appreciate quality." "Baking." Rebecca's tone held genuine warmth. "Nathan, I'd like you to meet Elizabeth Foster. She's going to be helping me at the bakery." "Elizabeth, this is Nathan Blackwood. He owns the Twin Pines Ranch east of town." Nathan touched his hat respectfully. "Pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Foster. Welcome to Pine Valley." Elizabeth found herself looking up into gray-green eyes that held the same direct honesty she had noticed in Rebecca. There was no judgment in his gaze, no calculation of her worth based on circumstances or social position. "Thank you, Mr. Blackwood. I'm looking forward to becoming part of the community. You picked a good place to settle. Pine Valley's got room for anyone willing to work hard and treat their neighbors fairly." His attention shifted to Rebecca. "Speaking of which, I'll need my usual order for Saturday. The hands are expecting your famous cinnamon rolls after we finish the branding." "Of course. I'll have everything ready by dawn." Rebecca's professional manner couldn't quite hide a subtle warmth when speaking with Nathan. After he continued on his way, Elizabeth glanced curiously at her new employer. "He seems very different from Mr. Sullivan." "Night and day," Rebecca agreed. "Nathan built his ranch from nothing, working as a hand for other outfits until he could afford his own land. He judges people by their character, not their pedigree. They returned to the bakery to find Emma and Thomas proudly displaying perfectly shaped rolls under Michael's encouraging supervision. The children's faces glowed with accomplishment, and Elizabeth felt her heart lift at seeing them so engaged and happy. "Look, Mama. Michael taught us how to make the dough smooth and stretchy. Can we help make rolls every day?" Thomas asked, his small face alight with enthusiasm. "We'll see," Elizabeth replied, ruffling his hair. "First you need to prove you can handle your delivery responsibilities." The morning passed in a blur of activity as Elizabeth learned the routines and rhythms of the bakery business. She served customers with the same skills she had developed in her late husband's household, managed inventory with practiced efficiency, and gradually began to understand the complex web of relationships that define Pine Valley's commercial district. Around midday, as the lunch crowd began to thin, the bakery door opened to admit Elizabeth hadn't seen before. He was younger than Nathan Blackwood, perhaps in his early 30s, with auburn hair and the lean build of someone who spent long hours in physical labor. What caught her attention immediately was the way he moved with the careful deliberation of someone favoring an old injury. "Afternoon, Rebecca," he said, his voice carrying a slight Eastern accent. "Heard you might have some help today." Rebecca smiled warmly. "Indeed I do. Samuel Cooper, meet Elizabeth Foster." "Elizabeth, Sam is our local blacksmith and the most skilled metalworker in 3 counties. Sam's handshake was firm, despite obvious stiffness in his right shoulder. "Pleasure. Mrs. Foster, welcome to our little corner of Montana." "Thank you. I understand you're a blacksmith. That must be fascinating work." "Has its moments." Sam's expression grew more animated. "Keeps me busy anyway. Lot of ranches in the area, a lot of horses that need shoes and tools that need repair." "Sam's being modest," Rebecca interjected. "He's an artist with metal. You should see the ironwork he created for the new schoolhouse." As Sam and Rebecca discussed his usual order of meat pies for his lunch, Elizabeth noticed Emma watching the blacksmith with intense curiosity. The girl had always been drawn to craftsmanship and skilled trades, spending hours watching her father's work with ledgers and calculations back in Chicago. "You interested in metalwork, young lady?" Sam asked, having noticed Emma's attention. Emma nodded eagerly. "My friend Annie's father was a jeweler back home. He let me watch him work sometimes. He made silver necklaces that looked like delicate lace." Sam's eyes lit up with the enthusiasm of a craftsman meeting a potential apprentice. "Silver filigree, eh? That's poetry in metal. Tell you what, if your mother doesn't mind, you and your brother could stop by my shop sometime. I could show you how different metals behave when they're worked." Elizabeth started to decline automatically, but something in Sam's manner stopped her. There was no condescension in his offer, no adult humoring a child's fleeting interest. He was speaking to Emma as one curious mind to another, regardless of age. "That's very kind of you, Mr. Cooper. Perhaps when Emma and Thomas have proven themselves reliable with their bakery duties." "Of course. Work comes first, always." Sam's approval of her priorities was evident. "But craftsmanship is important too. World needs people who understand the value of making things well." As the afternoon progressed, Elizabeth began to form a clearer picture of Pine Valley's social landscape. There were the James Sullivans and Harold Bennetts concerned with status and appearances, but there were also the Rebecca Thompsons, Nathan Blackwoods, and Samuel Coopers, people who valued substance over style, character over credentials. The question was whether the second group held enough influence to outweigh the first when it came to determining her family's future in this community. That question gained new urgency when Victoria Hamilton herself entered the bakery late in the afternoon, her presence immediately commanding attention. She was an imposing woman, tall and elegantly dressed, with the bearing of someone accustomed to having her opinion sought and respected. "Rebecca," she said in crisp, cultured tones, "I understand you have a new employee. Rebecca's posture straightened almost imperceptibly. I do indeed. Elizabeth Foster, may I present Mrs. Victoria? Hamilton, Victoria, this is Elizabeth. Victoria's assessment was frank and thorough, her pale blue eyes missing nothing about Elizabeth's appearance, demeanor, or the quality of her work clothes. The scrutiny felt like standing before a judge awaiting verdict. Mrs. Foster, I understand. You've had rather a dramatic introduction to our community. Yes, ma'am. Not precisely what I had planned, but sometimes life has its own ideas about our direction. Something flickered in Victoria's eyes. Approval, perhaps, or at least interest in Elizabeth's composure under pressure. Indeed it does. I also understand you have experience in household management. I managed our family finances in Chicago for several years. Budgeting, mending, cooking, all the skills needed to maintain a home efficiently with limited resources. Victoria nodded slowly. Useful skills. Tell me, Mrs. Foster, how have you found our little town so far? The question felt like a test, and Elizabeth chose her words carefully. I find it full of opportunities for someone willing to work hard and contribute positively to the community. A diplomatic answer. Victoria's slight smile suggested. She appreciated the careful phrasing. I trust you'll find Pine Valley welcoming to those who prove their worth through actions rather than circumstances. After Victoria departed with a selection of pastries for her evening entertaining, Rebecca let out a breath Elizabeth hadn't realized she'd been holding. That went well, Rebecca said, relief evident in her voice. Victoria Hamilton just gave you her provisional approval. That's no small thing in this town. Between Olivia Jenkins's boarding house, Rebecca's employment offer, and now Victoria Hamilton's measured acceptance, the foundation for a new life was slowly forming. But as the sun began to set over Pine Valley, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Elizabeth knew that her true test was yet to come. Words of acceptance were one thing. Sustained support in the face of opposition was quite another. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove herself worthy of the chances she was being given. And somewhere in this growing frontier town, there had to be someone who would see in Emma and Thomas not just a complication or burden, but the wonderful children they truly were. Someone who might even welcome the chance to be a father to children who desperately needed one. That evening, as Elizabeth tucked Emma and Thomas into bed in their new room at Mrs. Jenkins's boarding house, her daughter surprised her with an observation that showed how much she had absorbed of their situation. "Mama, are you worried about something?" Elizabeth smoothed Emma's hair, considering how much truth a 7-year-old could handle. "I'm thinking about some new opportunities that might help us build an even better life here. Good opportunities or scary opportunities." Emma's perceptiveness never ceased to amaze her. "Both, I think. Sometimes the best opportunities are a little scary because they're important." Emma nodded sagely. "Like when I was scared to help with deliveries at Papa's office. But then I did it, and he was so proud he gave me a special ribbon for my hair." "Exactly like that, sweetheart." "Then I think you should do the scary opportunity," Emma said with the confidence of childhood. "Because you're the bravest person I know, and you always make things better even when they seem broken." As Elizabeth kissed her children goodnight and prepared for bed herself, she carried Emma's words with her like a talisman. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new possibilities, but tonight she felt the solid foundation of love and purpose that made any risk worth taking. 2 weeks had passed since Elizabeth and her children had settled into their routine at Olivia Jenkins's boarding house, and the rhythm of their new life was beginning to feel natural rather than foreign. Elizabeth rose each morning before dawn to help Rebecca prepare the day's baking, while Emma had thrown herself into her delivery duties with the enthusiasm of a girl finally given important responsibilities. Thomas had become Rebecca's unofficial taste tester, providing solemn opinions on new recipes with the serious demeanor of someone entrusted with a vital task. The October air had grown crisp, bringing with it the first hints of the Montana winter to come. Elizabeth wrapped her shawl more tightly around her shoulders as she made her way through the quiet streets to the bakery, her breath visible in small puffs that dissipated quickly in the dry air. Above her, the stars were fading into the pre-dawn sky, and she found herself appreciating the peaceful solitude of these early morning walks. Inside Thompson's bakery, Rebecca was already at work, her hands deep in a massive bowl of bread dough, the ovens radiating warmth throughout the kitchen, creating a cozy refuge against the morning chill. "Good morning," Elizabeth called softly, not wanting to startle her employer. "How long have you been here?" "About an hour. Couldn't sleep, so I decided to get a head start on the dinner rolls for the Hamilton party tonight." Rebecca looked up with a smile that seemed slightly strained. 50 dozen rolls, plus assorted pastries. Victoria doesn't do anything on a small scale. Elizabeth tied on her apron and began assembling ingredients for the day's regular production. Over the past weeks, she had learned to read Rebecca's moods, and something was clearly troubling her friend this morning. "Is everything all right? You seem worried." Rebecca paused in her kneading, considering her words carefully. "It's probably nothing, but I heard some concerning talk at the general store yesterday. About you and the children." Elizabeth's hands stilled on the measuring cup she'd been filling with flour. "What kind of talk?" "Nothing specific, just questions about how long you're planning to stay, whether you're really settled here or just passing through." Rebecca resumed her work with perhaps more force than the dough required. Harold Bennett was there, making comments about transient populations and the importance of stable community membership. The implications were clear enough. James Sullivan and his allies hadn't given up on their campaign to drive Elizabeth from Pine Valley. They had simply shifted to more subtle tactics. "I see." Elizabeth set down the measuring cup and faced Rebecca directly. "Are you having second thoughts about employing me? I would understand if—" "Absolutely not." Rebecca's response was immediate and fierce. "You're the best help I've ever had, and your presence here has improved my business considerably. Emma and Thomas are treasures, and anyone with eyes can see that. But," she hesitated, "but I worry about the pressure building against you. Bennett has influence, and he's not above using it to make life difficult for people who cross his clients." Rebecca's expression grew troubled. "I just want you to be prepared for whatever might come next." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Emma and Thomas, who burst through the bakery's back door with the barely contained energy of children who had important news to share. "Mama, guess what Mr. Sam showed us yesterday?" Emma was practically vibrating with excitement, her cheeks flushed from the cold morning air. "Good morning to you too, sweetheart," Elizabeth said, amused despite her concerns. "What did Mr. Cooper show you?" "He let us work the bellows for the forge, and he's making a special horseshoe with my initials in it, just for practice." Emma's eyes shone with enthusiasm. "He says I have good hands for delicate work, and if I keep practicing, maybe someday I could make beautiful things like the school railings." Elizabeth felt a familiar tug of emotion at seeing her daughter so enthusiastic about something. Since her father's death, Emma had been too serious, too aware of their precarious circumstances. Watching her embrace the wonder of learning a new skill reminded Elizabeth of the carefree child she had been before tragedy changed their lives. "That's wonderful, Emma. But remember, your first responsibility is helping Mrs. Thompson with deliveries." "I know, Mama. Mr. Sam says work comes first, always. But he also says it's important to have something that makes your heart happy." Emma began organizing the delivery baskets with practiced efficiency. "Mr. Sam says his forge work makes his heart happy even when his shoulder hurts from the old injury." Rebecca and Elizabeth exchanged glances over the children's heads. Samuel Cooper had indeed become an important figure in Emma's life, providing the kind of guidance and mentorship that Elizabeth couldn't offer herself. Elizabeth's mind raced with the implications. Such an event would indeed establish her as a valuable community member, but it would also put her directly in the spotlight, exactly where James Sullivan and his allies could cause the most trouble. "It's an intriguing idea," she said carefully, "but wouldn't such a large undertaking require considerable support from established community members?" "It would indeed, which is why I'm proposing to co-chair the organizing committee with you." Victoria's smile was triumphant. "Let's see Harold Bennett argue against an event sponsored by the Hamilton family." As Elizabeth rode back to town, with Victoria's proposal spinning through her thoughts, she realized that her life in Pine Valley had reached another turning point. The safe, quiet integration she had been building was about to be replaced by something much more visible and potentially much more rewarding. But visibility was a double-edged sword, and she would need to be very careful about how she wielded it. That evening, as she tucked Emma and Thomas into bed at the boarding house, her daughter surprised her with an observation that showed how much she had absorbed of their situation. "Mama, are you worried about the festival Mrs. Hamilton wants you to help with?" Elizabeth paused in the act of smoothing Emma's blanket. "What makes you think I'm worried?" "You get little lines here." Emma touched the space between her own eyebrows when you're thinking hard about something difficult. Elizabeth smiled, wondering when her 7-year-old had become so perceptive. "I'm not worried exactly. Just thinking carefully about what it might mean for us." "Is it because Mr. Sullivan doesn't like us?" Thomas asked from his bed on the other side of the small room. Despite being only 4, he had developed an uncanny ability to sense the undercurrents of adult interactions. "Mr. Sullivan doesn't know us well enough to like or dislike us," Elizabeth corrected gently. "He just has certain ideas about how things should be done, and sometimes new people with different ways of doing things make him uncomfortable." "Mrs. Hamilton isn't afraid of him," Emma observed. "She talked to me about the festival while you were arranging the pastries. She said it would have ice skating and a special children's pageant and hot chocolate for everyone." "That does sound wonderful. And she said I could help plan the children's activities if you said it was all right." Emma's eyes shone with excitement. "I've been thinking about games we could play in the snow, and maybe Mr. Sam could make special medallions for the winners." Elizabeth felt a surge of love for her daughter's enthusiasm and creativity. "You've given this a lot of thought already." "It would be good for Thomas too," Emma continued earnestly. "He could make friends with the other little boys in town. And then when school starts after the new year, he'd already know people." It struck Elizabeth then that her children had been considering their future in Pine Valley in ways she hadn't fully appreciated. They weren't just passively accepting the changes in their lives. They were actively planning how to build connections in their new community. "I think," she said slowly, "that the winter festival sounds like a wonderful opportunity for all of us. So you'll do it?" Emma sat up in bed, her excitement palpable. "I'll tell Mrs. Hamilton tomorrow that we accept her invitation." Emma threw her arms around Elizabeth's neck. "It's going to be the best festival ever, Mama. You'll see." As Elizabeth extinguished the lamp and closed the children's door, she carried Emma's confidence with her like a shield against her own doubts. Perhaps there was wisdom in approaching challenges with a child's straightforward enthusiasm, rather than an adult's cautious calculation of risks and rewards. The first crisis came on a Tuesday morning in early November when Elizabeth arrived at the bakery to find the front window shattered and glass scattered across the floor like fallen stars. Rebecca stood in the doorway, her face pale with shock and anger, holding a rock that had been wrapped in paper. "When did this happen?" Elizabeth asked, carefully stepping around the broken glass to reach her friend's side. "Sometime during the night. Mr. Davis from the hotel heard the crash around 2 in the morning but didn't see anyone." Rebecca's voice trembled slightly as she handed Elizabeth the rock. "There's a note." Elizabeth unwrapped the paper with growing dread. The message was brief and unsigned. "Outsiders aren't welcome. Leave while you still can." "This is about me," Elizabeth said, the weight of guilt settling heavily on her shoulders. "I'm so sorry, Rebecca. I never meant for my problems to affect your business." "Don't you dare apologize for the actions of cowards who attack property in the dark," Rebecca replied fiercely. "This is exactly the kind of intimidation Harold Bennett specializes in, calculated to seem anonymous while delivering a very specific message." As they worked together to clean up the damage, boarding up the window until a replacement could be installed, Elizabeth's mind raced through the implications. The attack had been timed perfectly to cause maximum disruption with minimal risk of discovery. It spoke of planning and local knowledge, someone who understood the bakery's routines and the neighborhood's patterns. "Maybe I should consider their advice," Elizabeth said quietly as they swept the last of the glass into a dustpan. "If my presence here is going to bring this kind of trouble, Elizabeth Foster, if you even think about letting bullies drive you away, I'll be very disappointed in you." Rebecca's tone broke no argument. "Besides, you forget that I've dealt with men who think intimidation is an acceptable solution to their problems. I didn't run from my father's manipulations, and I certainly won't run from a thrown rock." There. Conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Sheriff William Cooper, a weathered man in his 50s who had been keeping the peace in Pine Valley for nearly 15 years. He examined the damage with professional thoroughness, asking detailed questions about timing and potential witnesses. "I'll investigate, of course," he told them, "but I have to be honest. This kind of nighttime mischief is hard to prove without witnesses. Whoever did this knew exactly how to avoid getting caught." "What about the note?" Elizabeth asked. "Surely that provides some evidence of intent." Morrison studied the paper carefully. "Could have been written by anyone, no distinctive. Handwriting, common paper available at any store in town." He folded the note and tucked it into his shirt pocket. "I'll keep this for evidence, but don't expect miracles." After the sheriff departed, Elizabeth felt a familiar knot of anxiety forming in her stomach. The escalation from legal threats to property damage suggested that her opponents were growing more desperate and potentially more dangerous. The morning's troubles multiplied when Emma and Thomas arrived for their usual delivery duties. Emma took one look at the boarded window and immediately grasped the situation with the quick intelligence that sometimes made her seem older than her 7 years. "Someone hurt the bakery because of us, didn't they, Mama?" Elizabeth knelt beside her children, choosing her words carefully. "Someone did something very wrong because they don't understand that good people deserve to be treated with kindness regardless of where they come from." "Are we in danger?" Emma's hazel eyes held a seriousness that broke Elizabeth's heart. "We're going to be very careful, and we have many friends who are looking out for us," she assured them. "But sweetheart, if you ever feel scared or unsafe, I want you to tell me immediately. Promise?" Emma nodded solemnly, then surprised her by straightening her small shoulders with determination. "I'm not scared, Mama. Mr. Sam says brave people don't let bullies win, and we're brave people." The afternoon brought Elizabeth's first scheduled work session at Twin Pines Ranch, and despite the morning's events, she was grateful for the distraction of new challenges. Nathan met her at the ranch house with a warm smile that faltered when he noticed her subdued demeanor. "Everything all right? You seem troubled." Elizabeth hesitated, uncertain how much to share about the bakery incident, but Nathan's gray-green eyes held such genuine concern that she found herself explaining the morning's events in detail. His reaction was immediate and fierce. "Cowards!" He spat, his jaw tightening with anger. "Attacking a business, threatening a woman and children. There's no honor in any of it." "I'm beginning to think maybe they're right, though," Elizabeth sighed quietly. "Maybe it would be better for everyone if Emma, Thomas, and I moved on to somewhere else." Nathan stopped walking and turned to face her directly. "Elizabeth, look at me." When she met his eyes, his expression was intense and earnest. "Don't let fear make your decisions for you. You belong here, all 3 of you. Anyone with sense can see that you've been nothing but a blessing to this community." The conviction in his voice stirred something deep in Elizabeth's chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with gratitude and everything to do with the growing attraction she had been trying to ignore. "How can you be so certain?" she asked. "You barely know me. I know enough." Nathan's voice grew softer, more personal. "I know you work harder than anyone I've ever met. I know you're raising two fine children who are respectful, curious, and kind. I know you faced down James Sullivan's rejection with dignity and grace." He paused, seeming to gather courage. "And I know that you've brought something to this valley that's been missing for a long time. Mr. Nathan is a kind man who has been very helpful to us. But you could marry him if you wanted to, right?" Emma persisted. "Because I think he would be a good papa, and I think you would be happy." The innocent wisdom of childhood cuts straight to the heart of feelings Elizabeth had been trying to avoid examining too closely. Did she want to marry Nathan Blackwood? And more importantly, was she ready to open her heart to that possibility? "Someday, perhaps," she said carefully. "But for now, we're focusing on building our life here and proving that we belong in Pine Valley." "Okay," Emma said simply, apparently satisfied with her answer. "But Mama, I hope someday comes soon. I like it when you smile the way you do about Mr. Nathan." As Elizabeth tucked her children into bed that night, she carried Emma's words with her like a gentle benediction. Outside, the Montana wind whispered through the pine trees, carrying with it the promise of changes yet to come. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight she allowed herself to hope that those changes might include the kind of happiness she had stopped believing was possible. The Thursday evening meeting at the church social hall drew a larger crowd than anyone had anticipated. By 7 o'clock, every chair was occupied, and people stood along the walls, creating an atmosphere of electric anticipation that hummed through the packed room. Elizabeth sat in the front row beside Victoria Hamilton, acutely aware that every eye in the room was focused on them with varying degrees of curiosity, support, and skepticism. Reverend Samuel Mitchell, a kindly man in his 60s who had served the Pine Valley community for nearly 20 years, opened the meeting with a brief prayer for wisdom and unity. As heads bowed and voices murmured, "Amen," Elizabeth caught sight of James Sullivan entering through the back door, his presence immediately noted by the subtle shift in the room's energy. "Friends and neighbors," Victoria began, rising to address the gathering with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to commanding attention. "We are here tonight to discuss something that could bring our entire community together in celebration of our shared prosperity and values." She outlined the vision for the winter festival with practiced eloquence, describing a 3-day event that would showcase local ranchers and farmers, provide entertainment for families, and attract visitors from surrounding counties. As she spoke, Elizabeth watched faces throughout the room, noting the growing enthusiasm among most attendees. "The success of such an undertaking," Victoria continued, "will require the participation and support of every segment of our community. Which is why I am pleased to introduce my co-chair for this project, Mrs. Elizabeth Foster." Elizabeth rose on slightly unsteady legs, her mouth dry with nervousness. She had addressed tradespeople and household staff in her late husband's home, but never had she faced an audience where so much depended on her words. "Thank you, Mrs. Hamilton, and thank you all for coming tonight." Her voice started soft but grew stronger as she continued. "I know that some of you may have questions about my qualifications for this responsibility. I can only say that I have experience organizing community events in Chicago, managing vendor relationships, and coordinating complex logistics." She paused, gathering courage for what she needed to say next. "More importantly, I believe in the power of communities to support and strengthen each other. I have experienced firsthand the difference between places where people are judged by their circumstances and places where they are valued for their contributions." A murmur of approval rippled through portions of the crowd, though Elizabeth noticed that James Sullivan's section remained conspicuously silent. For the next hour, the meeting buzzed with suggestions, questions, and volunteer commitments. Martha Davis offered to coordinate food vendors. Samuel Cooper proposed a demonstration area for traditional crafts. And Dr. William Henley suggested medical stations for safety. Even some of those Elizabeth had expected to oppose the project seemed caught up in the enthusiasm. As the meeting wound down and people began forming small groups to discuss specific aspects of the festival, Elizabeth felt a tap on her shoulder. She turned to find Nathan Blackwood, his gray-green eyes warm with admiration. "That was well done," he said quietly. "You handled the questions with grace and authority." "I was terrified," Elizabeth admitted, surprised by her own candor. "Couldn't tell. You looked like you were born to lead community meetings." Nathan glanced around the bustling room. "Walk with me? There's something I'd like to discuss." They stepped onto the church's front porch, where the November evening air carried the crisp promise of approaching winter. Stars blazed overhead in the clear Montana sky, and Elizabeth pulled her shawl closer around her shoulders. "The festival is going to be a tremendous success," Nathan said, leaning against the porch railing. "But I suspect you know that's not really what tonight was about." Elizabeth looked at him questioningly. "Tonight was about the community making a choice," he continued. "About what kind of place Pine Valley is going to be. And judging by the response in there, most folks chose tolerance and inclusion over fear and prejudice." "Some did," Elizabeth agreed carefully, "but not everyone. I noticed that Mr. Sullivan and his supporters didn't seem particularly enthusiastic." Nathan's expression darkened slightly. "James Sullivan is discovering that his influence has limits. When push comes to shove, most people would rather support someone who's building something positive than someone who's just tearing others down." They stood in companionable silence for a moment, both lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Nathan turned to face her directly. "Elizabeth, there's something I need to tell you. Something I should have said weeks ago." The serious tone in his voice made her pulse quicken. "What is it?" "I didn't offer you work at the ranch just because I needed bookkeeping help." His words came in a rush, as if he feared losing courage if he spoke slowly. "I mean, I do need the help, but that wasn't my primary motivation." Elizabeth's breath caught. "What was it?" "I wanted to spend time with you. I wanted to get to know you better, to understand what makes you laugh and what worries you and what dreams you have. For the future." Nathan ran a hand through his hair. A gesture she had learned indicated his nervousness. "I haven't felt this way about anyone since my late wife Sarah." The mention of his deceased wife surprised Elizabeth. In all their conversations, Nathan had never spoken of his past relationships or explained why a successful, attractive man in his late 30s remained unmarried. "I didn't know you had been married," she said gently. 6 years ago, childbirth took her and our infant son." Pain flickered across his features. "I thought I was done with love, that I'd had my chance and lost it. For 5 years I believed that, and then—" Nathan stepped closer, his voice dropping to an intimate register that made her heart race. "Then I met a woman who makes me remember what it feels like to want to share my life with someone. A woman who faces adversity with courage and kindness. Who raises children any man would be proud to call his own." Elizabeth felt tears prick her eyes at the sincerity in his words. "Nathan, I know it's complicated," he continued quickly. "I know you came here expecting to marry someone else, and I know you're still establishing yourself in the community. I'm not asking for an answer tonight or even soon. I just needed you to know how I feel." Before Elizabeth could respond, the church door opened behind them and Emma and Thomas emerged with Samuel Cooper, who had apparently been entertaining the children during the meeting. "Mama, Mr. Sam showed us the drawings for the festival demonstration area, and there's going to be a whole section for metalwork." Emma's excitement was infectious, providing a natural break in the intensity of the moment. "That sounds wonderful." "Sweetheart," Elizabeth's voice was slightly breathless, her mind still reeling from Nathan's declaration. Sam tipped his hat to both adults. "Evening, folks. Fine meeting tonight. This festival is going to put Pine Valley on the map." He glanced meaningfully between Elizabeth and Nathan. "I'll walk the children back to the boarding house if you want to continue your conversation. Actually, we should head back too," Elizabeth said, needing time to process everything Nathan had revealed. "It's been a long day." As they walked through the quiet streets toward Olivia Jenkins's boarding house, Emma and Thomas chatted about the evening's discoveries, while Elizabeth wrestled with the implications of Nathan's confession. By the time they reached their temporary home, her children had extracted promises of future visits to both the blacksmith shop and Twin Pines Ranch. "I like Mr. Nathan," Thomas announced as Elizabeth helped him prepare for bed. "He's kind to us and he makes you smile." "He's a good friend," Elizabeth replied carefully. "Mama, you know I'm not a baby, right?" Emma fixed her with those wise hazel eyes that always seemed to see too much. "I know when grown-ups like each other the way you and Mr. Nathan do." Elizabeth sat on the edge of her daughter's bed, struck once again by her perceptiveness. "What would you think if Mr. Nathan and if we became more than friends?" Emma considered this seriously. "Would we live at the ranch with the horses?" "Possibly, if that ever happened." "And would Mr. Nathan be our papa, like really and truly?" The longing in her voice nearly broke Elizabeth's heart. "Would you like that?" "Yes," Emma said simply. "I miss having a papa, and Mr. Nathan is the kind of man who would teach us important things and keep us safe. And Thomas needs a papa even more than I do, because he doesn't remember our real papa as well as I do." Elizabeth kissed her daughter's forehead, marveling at the clarity with which a 7-year-old could see what adults made complicated. "We'll see what the future brings, sweetheart. But for now, let's focus on making the festival the best celebration Pine Valley has ever seen." The following days passed in a whirlwind of planning and preparation, as the festival committee threw itself into the monumental task of organizing the community's first major celebration. Elizabeth found herself at the center of a complex web of logistics, managing vendor applications, coordinating with performers, and overseeing the countless details that would determine the event's success or failure. Her days now split between morning work at the bakery, afternoon sessions at Nathan's ranch office, and evening festival meetings. The routine left her exhausted, but exhilarated as she discovered capabilities she hadn't known she possessed. The organizational skills that had served her in her late husband's household proved perfectly suited to managing the larger, more complex challenges of community event planning. More importantly, the festival work was having exactly the effect Victoria Hamilton had intended. Elizabeth's competence and dedication were becoming impossible to ignore, even among those who had initially opposed her presence in Pine Valley. When the committee needed someone to negotiate with the traveling performers from Helena, Elizabeth's business experience proved invaluable. When disputes arose between competing vendors, her diplomatic skills smoothed over potential conflicts. "You're transforming before my eyes," Rebecca observed one afternoon as they worked together in the bakery kitchen. 2 months ago, you were a frightened woman stepping off a train with nothing but hope. Now you're practically running this town." "Hardly running it," Elizabeth protested, though she couldn't deny the truth in her friend's observation. "Just trying to help where I can." "Elizabeth, there's a difference between helping and leading, and what you're doing is definitely leadership." Rebecca's expression grew more serious. "The question is, are you ready for what comes with that?" Before Elizabeth could ask what she meant, the conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Sheriff Cooper, his expression grim as he approached the counter. "Ladies, I need to speak with Mrs. Foster privately if you don't mind." Elizabeth's stomach clenched with sudden anxiety. "What's wrong?" The sheriff glanced around the bakery, noting the presence of several customers within earshot. "Perhaps we could step into the back room." Once they were alone, The sheriff's professional mask slipped slightly, revealing genuine concern. "Elizabeth, I've received some disturbing information that I felt you should know about immediately." "What kind of information?" "Harold Bennett has been making inquiries about your background. Specifically, he's been in contact with authorities in Chicago, trying to gather information about your late husband's business dealings and the circumstances of your departure." Elizabeth felt the color drain from her face. She had been honest about the general circumstances that brought her to Montana, but there were details about her husband's financial difficulties and the extent of their debts that she had shared. "With no one. Has he found anything problematic?" The sheriff's expression softened with sympathy. "Nothing that reflects poorly on your character, but information that could be misrepresented by someone with malicious intent. Your husband's business failure, the extent of the debts you inherited, the fact that you left Chicago with creditors still pursuing you." The relief Elizabeth felt was immediately overshadowed by new worry. "Is there anything illegal about our situation?" "Not illegal, no. But in the hands of someone like Bennett, such information could be used to undermine your credibility and position in the community." Morrison paused meaningfully. "Particularly if it were to surface at a critical moment, such as right before the festival." Elizabeth understood the implication immediately. Bennett was preparing to launch a character assassination campaign, designed to destroy her reputation precisely when her success would be most visible and most damaging to his client's interests. "What should I do?" "Get ahead of it," the sheriff advised firmly. "Control the narrative by sharing the truth on your own terms rather than letting Bennett twist it to his advantage." That evening, Elizabeth sat at the small desk in her boarding house room, staring at a blank piece of paper as she struggled to find the right words. Finally, she began to write. "To the citizens of Pine Valley, I have recently learned that questions have been raised about my background and the circumstances that brought my children and me to your community. Rather than allow others to characterize my situation, I believe you deserve to hear the truth directly from me." She went on to explain her husband's business failure, the debts that had consumed their assets, and her decision to leave Chicago in search of a fresh start. She described the months of struggle, the difficult choices she had made, and her gratitude for the opportunities Pine Valley had provided. I have never claimed to be anything other than a widow, seeking to build a respectable life for her children. I have worked hard to contribute positively to this community, and I believe my actions over the past 2 months demonstrate my character more clearly than the circumstances that brought me here. I share this information not because I am ashamed of my past, but because I believe in the importance of honesty and transparency in all my relationships. If there are those who feel that my previous struggles disqualify me from participation in community life, I respect their right to that opinion. However, I hope that most of you will judge me by my actions and contributions rather than by the difficulties I have overcome. Respectfully yours, Elizabeth Foster. The next morning, Elizabeth delivered copies of the letter to the general store, the hotel, and the church, requesting that they be posted in prominent locations. By afternoon, her preemptive honesty had become the talk of the town, generating discussions in every business and gathering place in Pine Valley. The response was more positive than she had dared hope. Rather than condemning her for her past struggles, most community members seemed to admire her courage in addressing the situation directly, even some of those who had been neutral toward her expressed approval for her straightforward approach. "Brilliant strategy," Victoria Hamilton told her that evening during the festival committee meeting. "You turned Bennett's weapon against him by embracing the very information he intended to use for character assassination." But it was Nathan's reaction that mattered most to Elizabeth. He appeared at the boarding house just after dinner, requesting a private conversation. They walked together through the quiet residential streets, both deep in thought. "I read your letter," he said finally. Elizabeth felt her pulse quicken with anxiety. Would Nathan see her differently now that he knew the full extent of her desperate circumstances in Chicago? Nathan stopped walking and turned to face her, his expression intense with emotion. "And I have never admired anyone more than I admire you right now." Elizabeth felt tears threaten at the sincerity in his voice. "Elizabeth, you could have hidden from your past, constructed elaborate explanations, or simply left town when the mesva pressure mounted. Instead, you chose courage and honesty, even when it put everything you've built here at risk." "I was terrified," she admitted. "I still am. That's what makes it courage." Nathan reached for her hands, holding them gently in his calloused palms. "I told you the other night that I was falling in love with you. After today, I need you to know that I'm completely, irrevocably in love with you." Elizabeth's breath caught at the declaration. "I know the timing isn't perfect," Nathan continued, his gray-green eyes holding hers with unwavering intensity. "I know you're still establishing yourself here, and I know the festival is consuming all your energy. But I also know that life doesn't wait for perfect timing." He took a deep breath. "Elizabeth Foster, will you marry me?" The proposal was so direct, so heartfelt that Elizabeth felt her careful defenses crumble completely. This man loved her. Not despite her struggles, but because of the strength she had shown in overcoming them. He wanted not just her but Emma and Thomas as well, offering them both the security and love they had been seeking. "Yes," she whispered, surprised by the certainty in her own voice. "Yes, Nathan, I will marry you." His smile blazed across his features like sunrise as he pulled her into his arms, holding her with a tenderness that spoke of promise and protection and passionate commitment. When they finally separated, both breathless with the magnitude of what had just occurred, Nathan cupped her face in his hands. "I promise you," he said solemnly, "that neither you nor your children will ever face anything alone again. We're a family now, the four of us, and families stand together through whatever comes." As they walked back toward the boarding house, hand in hand, Elizabeth felt a peace settle over her that she hadn't experienced since before her first husband's death. The future was still uncertain. The festival still loomed as a major test, and there would undoubtedly be challenges ahead. But for the first time in years, she was facing that future not as a single mother struggling to protect her children, but as part of a partnership built on love, respect, and shared commitment to building something beautiful together. The morning of Pine Valley's first annual winter festival dawned crisp and clear, with December sunlight painting the Montana landscape in shades of pristine white and sparkling silver. Elizabeth stood on the front porch of the Twin Pines Ranch house, watching the sunrise cast long blue shadows across the snow-covered hills while steam rose from her coffee cup. 2 weeks had passed since Nathan's proposal, and in that time their lives had transformed in ways she was still learning to comprehend. The wedding had been a simple affair held in the Pine Valley Church, with the entire community in attendance. Reverend Mitchell had performed the ceremony with obvious joy, and even some of those who had initially opposed Elizabeth's presence had offered genuine congratulations afterward. Emma had served as flower girl with solemn pride, and Thomas had carried the rings on a small velvet pillow, his face alight with the importance of his task. Now, as Mrs. Nathan Blackwood, Elizabeth found herself preparing to oversee the culmination of weeks of intensive planning. The festival grounds stretched across the meadow behind the church, with booths and stages arranged in careful patterns that would maximize both foot traffic and safety. Vendors had arrived from as far away as Helena, drawn by word-of-mouth reports of Pine Valley's ambitious celebration. Nervous? Nathan appeared beside her, slipping his arms around her waist from behind and pressing a gentle kiss to her temple. "Excited," Elizabeth corrected, leaning back against his solid warmth. "I keep thinking about how different everything is from 3 months ago. Better different, or just different." Elizabeth turned in his arms to face him, struck once again by the way his gray-green eyes held such genuine affection when he looked at her. Wonderfully and possibly better. Their conversation was interrupted by the thunder of approaching hoofbeats as Emma and Thomas galloped into the yard on their ponies, their riding skills now confident enough that Elizabeth no longer worried about every outing. Behind them rode Joseph, the young ranch hand who had become both teacher and friend to the children. "Mama, Papa Nathan," Emma called, using the title that had evolved naturally in the weeks since the wedding. "The festival people are already setting up, and there's a man with trained dogs who can do all sorts of tricks." Elizabeth marveled at the transformation in her daughter. The careful, serious child who had stepped off the train in Pine Valley had blossomed into a confident, enthusiastic girl who approached each day with curiosity and joy. The security of belonging to a real family again, combined with the mentorship of Nathan, Samuel Cooper, and others, had allowed Emma to simply be a child again. Thomas slid from his pony with the ease of a boy who had been riding his whole life, though it had been barely a month since his first lesson. "And there's a lady making snow candy with maple syrup. Can we try some, please?" "Well then," Nathan said, helping Thomas brush snow from his coat, "I suppose we'd better get down there and make sure everything's ready for our guests." The festival grounds buzzed with organized chaos as vendors completed their setup and performers prepared for the day's entertainment. Elizabeth moved through the organized confusion with practiced efficiency, checking on logistics, resolving minor conflicts, and ensuring that every detail met the high standards she had established for Pine Valley's inaugural celebration. Mrs. Blackwood called Olivia Jenkins, who was overseeing the food vendors area. "The judges for the pie contest want to know if they should start tasting at 10 or 11 o'clock. 10:30, Elizabeth replied without hesitation. "That gives the late entries time to arrive, but ensures we finish before the noon meal rush." As morning progressed into afternoon, the festival exceeded even Elizabeth's optimistic expectations. Families from ranches throughout the county filled the grounds. Children shrieked with delight at the ice skating pond and the snow sculpture competition, and the demonstration areas drew enthusiastic crowds eager to learn about traditional crafts and skills. Elizabeth found herself standing near the blacksmithing demonstration, watching Samuel Cooper explain the art of metalwork to a fascinated audience that included several children and their parents. Emma stood at the front of the group, glowing with pride as Sam displayed the delicate silver ornament she had helped create during her recent lessons. "You should be proud," observed a familiar voice behind her. Elizabeth turned to find Victoria Hamilton elegantly dressed despite the informal setting, her usually composed expression showing genuine warmth. "Of Emma, I always am." "Of Emma?" "Certainly, but I meant of yourself. Look around you, Elizabeth. This festival is bringing together people who might never have met otherwise, creating connections and friendships that will strengthen our entire region." Victoria's smile held deep satisfaction. "More importantly, it's established you as an indispensable part of this community's leadership. It was your idea originally. The concept was mine, but the execution is entirely yours. There's a significant difference between having an idea and bringing it to life successfully." Victoria paused meaningfully. "I suspect this is just the beginning of your contributions to Pine Valley's development." Before Elizabeth could ask what she meant by that cryptic comment, they were joined by Sheriff Cooper, his usually serious expression lighter than Elizabeth had ever seen it. "Ladies, I wanted to let you know that we've had visitors from 4 different counties asking about next year's festival. Seems word is spreading faster than we anticipated." "That's wonderful news," Elizabeth replied, though she felt a flutter of anxiety about the implications of increased expectations for future events. "There's more," the sheriff continued, his tone becoming more official. "Harold Bennett approached me this morning. Wanted to discuss some concerns about crowd control and public safety." Elizabeth tensed, recognizing the signs of another attempt at official interference. "I told him," Sheriff Cooper continued with evident satisfaction, "that in 20 years of law enforcement, I've never seen a community event better organized or more safely managed. Suggested that if he had specific concerns, he should address them directly with the festival committee rather than trying to create problems through legal channels. Victoria's smile turned predatory. How did he respond to that suggestion? About as well as you'd expect. But without concrete complaints or legitimate safety issues, there's nothing he can do officially. The sheriff tipped his hat to both women. "Excuse me, ladies. I need to check on the horse-drawn sleigh rides." As the afternoon wore on, Elizabeth found herself increasingly amazed by the festival's success. The food vendors sold out of specialties. The craftsmen received multiple commissions for future work, and the musicians drew crowds that spilled far beyond the designated performance areas. But perhaps most gratifying was the social mixing she observed throughout the grounds. Ranch families who rarely interacted were discovering common interests. Children from different economic backgrounds were forming friendships, and the arbitrary social divisions that had seemed so important to some community members were dissolving in the face of shared celebration. "Mama!" Emma appeared at her side, slightly out of breath from excitement. "You have to come see the sleigh race." "Papa, Nathan is competing, and Thunderbolt and Lightning are the fastest horses in the whole territory." Elizabeth allowed herself to be dragged toward the makeshift racing track, where a crowd had gathered to watch the final heat of the day's competition. Nathan sat in a sleigh behind his matched pair of black geldings at the starting line alongside 5 other drivers. Even from a distance, Elizabeth could see the competitive gleam in his eye. "He's going to win," Thomas declared with absolute confidence, having appeared at her other side. "Papa Nathan told me that his horses love to run in the snow, and Papa Nathan is the best driver in Montana." "We'll see," Elizabeth replied diplomatically, though she privately agreed with her son's assessment. The starting signal sent 6 sleighs gliding across the packed snow, runners hissing against the ice as drivers urged their teams toward the finish line. Nathan and his horses pulled ahead early, maintaining their lead throughout the half-mile course to win by 3 lengths amid cheers from the appreciative crowd. Emma and Thomas jumped up and down with excitement as Nathan guided his team back toward them, his face flushed with exertion and triumph. "Did you see, Mama? Did you see how fast they went?" Thomas's small face was alight with pride in his new father. "I saw," Elizabeth laughed, accepting Nathan's kiss as he leaped down from the sleigh. "Congratulations, champion." "The prize is purely symbolic," Nathan said, removing his gloves to warm his hands against Elizabeth's cheeks. "But Thunderbolt and Lightning deserve recognition for their effort." As evening approached and the festival began winding down, Elizabeth stood with Nathan and the children on a small rise overlooking the grounds, watching families pack up their purchases and head home with tired but satisfied expressions. "I can't believe it's almost over," Emma said, her voice holding the melancholy of a child whose perfect day was ending. "This festival is over," Nathan corrected gently, "but there will be others. And more importantly, all the friendships and connections made today will continue long after the booths are packed away." Elizabeth nodded, understanding the deeper truth in her husband's words. The festival had been successful as an event, but its real value lay in what it had created for the community's future. "Mrs. Blackwood," a hesitant voice behind them caused Elizabeth to turn. She was surprised to see James Sullivan standing a few feet away, his usually confident demeanor replaced by something that looked remarkably like humility. "Mr. Sullivan, I hope you've enjoyed the festival." "I have, actually, more than I expected to." He shifted uncomfortably, clearly struggling with whatever had brought him to seek her out. "I wanted to. That is, I felt I should." Nathan stepped protectively closer to Elizabeth, his expression wary but not hostile. "I owe you an apology," Sullivan finally managed. "My behavior at the train station was inexcusable. I let my concerns about social propriety override basic Christian charity and human decency." Elizabeth studied his face, searching for signs of insincerity, but finding only genuine regret. "I appreciate you saying that, Mr. Sullivan. I've watched what you've accomplished here, how you've contributed to our community, and I realize I was wrong. About everything." He glanced at Emma and Thomas, who were watching the adult conversation with interest. "You've clearly raised fine children, and any man who couldn't see that doesn't deserve to be called a father." The admission was clearly difficult for him, but Elizabeth sensed its sincerity. "We all make mistakes, Mr. Sullivan. What matters is learning from them." "Indeed." He nodded formally to Nathan. "Blackwood, you're a fortunate man. I hope you appreciate what you have." "More than you can imagine," Nathan replied evenly. After Sullivan departed, the four of them stood in contemplative silence as the last of the festival crowds dispersed into the gathering dusk. "Are you really happy, Mama?" Emma asked suddenly, the question so direct it caught Elizabeth off guard. "What makes you ask that, sweetheart? Sometimes you get a faraway look, like you're thinking about sad things. I just want to make sure you're really, truly happy and not just pretending for us." Elizabeth knelt beside her daughter, moved by her perceptiveness and her concern for her mother's well-being. At 7 years old, Emma had already learned to read the subtle signs of adult emotions, a skill developed through necessity during their months of uncertainty. "I am really, truly happy," she assured her. "Happier than I ever thought I could be again. Sometimes I do think about sad things, missing your first papa, remembering the hard times we went through. But those thoughts don't make me unhappy now. They just remind me how precious what we have is." Emma nodded solemnly, then surprised her by turning to Nathan. "Papa Nathan, are you happy too? Really and truly?" Nathan crouched down to Emma's level, his expression serious and thoughtful. "Emma, before your mama brought you and Thomas to Pine Valley, I thought I knew what my life was going to look like. I thought I'd spend my days working the ranch and my evenings alone, and that would be enough. But it wasn't enough, was it?" Thomas asked, leaning against Nathan's side with the easy familiarity of a child who felt completely secure in his affection. "No, it wasn't. I just didn't realize it until I met you and your mama." Nathan's voice grew warmer. "Now I can't imagine wanting any life other than the one where I get to come home to all of you every evening." "Good," Emma declared with satisfaction, "because I like our family exactly the way it is." As they made their way back to the ranch house in the deepening twilight, Elizabeth reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. 4 months ago, she had been a desperate widow with limited options, willing to marry a stranger for the promise of security. Tonight, she was returning home with a husband who loved her completely and children who had found the father figure they needed. The house itself had been transformed as well. What had once been the functional dwelling of a solitary rancher now bore the touches of a family home. Elizabeth's sewing basket occupied one corner of the main room, Emma and Thomas's books and toys were scattered on shelves Nathan had built especially for them, and the kitchen showed evidence of daily use by people who enjoyed cooking and eating together. "I have something to show you," Nathan said as they settled in the sitting room after dinner, the children already nodding off against Elizabeth's sides, despite their attempts to stay awake for adult conversation. He retrieved a letter from his desk drawer, his expression barely containing excitement. "This came today, addressed to the festival committee but delivered to me as your husband." Elizabeth accepted the envelope, noting the official seal of the Montana Territory. Inside, she found a formal letter from the governor's office, praising the success of Pine Valley's Winter Festival and requesting information about replicating the event in other developing communities. "They want us to help other towns organize their own festivals," Nathan explained. "They're offering funding and official territorial support for a regional program." Elizabeth stared at the letter, overwhelmed by the implications. This would be significant. More than significant. It would establish you as a recognized expert in community development, with opportunities to travel and consult throughout Montana. Nathan's pride in her accomplishments was evident in every word. But what about the ranch? What about our life here? The ranch will always be here, and so will I. But Elizabeth, you have talents that could benefit communities throughout the territory. I would never want to hold you back from using those gifts. Elizabeth looked down at Emma and Thomas, now fully asleep against her shoulders, then back at the letter that represented possibilities she had never imagined. Would you really support me taking on something this ambitious? I would support you in anything that makes you happy and fulfilled, Nathan replied without hesitation. Besides, Emma and Thomas could travel with you sometimes. They're old enough to find educational value in seeing different communities, and I could always use the excuse to visit other ranching operations. As Elizabeth tucked her children into bed that night, in the rooms that were now truly their own, decorated with their treasures and the things Nathan had crafted for them, she marveled at how completely their lives had been transformed. "Mama," Emma mumbled sleepily as Elizabeth pulled the quilt up to her chin, "when we help other towns have festivals, can we make sure they know that families come in all different kinds?" "What do you mean, sweetheart?" "Like how we're a family even, though Papa Nathan isn't our first papa. And how Mr. Sam takes care of his nephew even though he's not married. And how Mrs. Thompson has Michael working at her bakery and considers him like her son even though they're not related." Emma's words were slurred with exhaustion, but her meaning was clear. Just that families are about loving people, not about how you got together. Elizabeth kissed her daughter's forehead, struck once again by her wisdom. "Yes, sweetheart. We'll make sure people understand that." Later, as she and Nathan prepared for bed in the room they now shared, Elizabeth found herself thinking about the letter and its implications for their future. "Are you worried about the opportunities it might bring?" Nathan asked, having noticed her thoughtful mood. "Not worried exactly, more amazed, I suppose. 6 months ago, I was a widow with no prospects, desperately hoping to find someone who would accept Emma, Thomas, and me. Now I'm being asked to help shape community development policy for the entire territory." Nathan pulled her into his arms, his expression tender with love and admiration. "You know what I think the real transformation has been? You've stopped seeing yourself as someone who needs to be accepted and started recognizing yourself as someone who has valuable contributions to offer." His hands cupped her face gently. "You were never the desperate woman you thought you were, Elizabeth. You were always someone worth treasuring. It just took the right circumstances for that truth to become obvious to everyone, including yourself." As Elizabeth fell asleep in her husband's arms, listening to the peaceful sounds of their Montana ranch settling into nighttime quiet, she reflected on the unexpected journey that had brought her to this place of belonging and purpose. She had come to Pine Valley seeking security and found love instead. She had hoped to blend quietly into an established community, and instead had discovered her own capacity for leadership. Most importantly, she had wanted Emma and Thomas to have a father, and they had gained not just Nathan, but an entire network of adults who cared about their development and future. The mail-order bride who had been rejected for having children had become a woman whose family was celebrated as an example of love's power to create bonds stronger than blood or convention.